Alright guys, let's continue with the painted bird. It's a long chapter. Don't really not really into this book. It's a smart guy doing his research and stuff. So chapter 11. The priest took me away in a borrowed cart. He said that he would find someone in a nearby village to take care of me until the end of the war. Before reaching the village, we stopped at the local church. The priest left me in the cart and went alone to the vicarage, where I saw him arguing with the vicar. The vicar. They gesticulated and whispered agitatedly. Then they both came toward me. I jumped off the cart and bowed politely to the vicar. Kissing his sleeve, he looked at me, gave me his blessing, and returned to the vicarage without saying another word. The priest drove on and finally stopped at the far end of the village at a rather isolated farmhouse. He went in and stayed there so long that I began to wonder if something had happened to him. A huge wolfhound with a sullen, downcast expression guarded the farmyard. The priest came out, accompanied by a short, thick-set peasant. The dog tucked his tail under his hindquarters and stopped growling. The man looked at me, then stepped aside with the priest. I could hear only snatches of their conversation. The farmer was obviously upset. Pointing to me, he shouted that one look was enough to tell I was an unbaptized gypsy bastard. The priest quietly protested, but the man would not listen. He argued that keeping me might expose him to great danger, since the Germans often visited the village, and if they found me, it would be too late for any intervention. The priest was gradually losing his patience. He suddenly took the man by the arm and whispered something into his ear. The peasant became subdued and cursing, told me to follow him into the hut. The priest came closer to me and looked into my eyes. We stared at each other in silence. I did not quite know what to do. Trying to kiss his hand, I kissed my own sleeve and became confused. He laughed, made the sign of the cross over my head, and departed. As soon as he was sure that the priest was gone, the man grabbed me by the ear, almost lifting me off the ground, and pulled me into the hut. When I yelled, he jabbed me in the ribs with his finger so hard that I became breathless. There were 3 of us in the household: the farmer Garbos, who had a dead, unsmiling face and half-open mouth, the dog, Judas, with slying, glowering eyes, and myself. Garbos was a widower. Sometimes in the course of an argument, neighbors would mention an orphan Jewish girl called Lilka, whom Garbos took as a boarder from her escaping parents some time ago. Whenever one of the Garbos' cows or pigs damaged some of the crops, the villagers would maliciously remind him of this girl. They would say that he used to beat her daily, rape her, and force her to commit depravities until she finally vanished. Meanwhile, Garbos renovated his farm with the money he received for her keep. Garbos listened angrily to such accusations. He would unleash Judas and threaten to set him against the slanderers. Each time the neighbors locked their doors and watched the evil beast through their windows. No one ever visited Garbos. He always sat alone in his hut. My job was to look after 2 pigs, a cow, a dozen hens, and 2 turkeys. Why would the priest leave him with him? Without saying a word, Garbos used to beat me unexpectedly and for no reason. He would steal behind me and hit me on the legs with the whip. He would twist my ears, rub his thumb in my hair, and tickle my armpits and feet until I shook uncontrollably. He regarded me as a gypsy and ordered me to tell him gypsy stories, but all I could recite were the poems and stories I had learned at home before the war. Listening to them would sometimes infuriate Garbos. For what reason I never knew. He would beat me again or threaten to turn Judas loose on me. Judas was a constant menace. He could kill a man with one bite of his fangs. The neighbors often reproached Garbos for having unleashed the beast on someone stealing apples. The thief's throat was torn out and he died immediately. Garbos always incited Judas against me. Gradually, the dog must have become convinced that I was his worst enemy. The sight of me was enough to make him bristle like a porcupine. His bloodshot eyes, his nose, his lips quivered, and froth dripped over his sharp fangs. He strained toward me with such force that I was afraid he might break the guide wire, though I also hoped that he would strangle himself on his leash. Seeing the dog's fury and my fear, Garbos would sometimes untie Judas, lead him only by the collar, and make him back me against the wall. The growling, sputtering mouth was only inches from my throat, and the animal's big body shook with savage fury. He nearly choked, frothing and spitting, while the man urged him on with hard words and sharp proddings. He came so close that his warm, moist breath dampened my face. At such moments, life would almost pass out of me, and my blood would flow through my veins with a slow, sluggish drip, like heavy spring honey straining through the narrow neck of a bottle. My terror was such that it nearly transported me to the other world. I looked at the beast's burning eyes and at the man's hairy, freckled hand gripping the collar. At any moment, the dog's teeth might close over my flesh. Not wanting to suffer, I would push my neck forward for the first quick bite. I understood then the fox's mercy in killing geese by severing their necks in one snap. But Garbos did not release the dog. Instead, he sat down in front of me, drinking moonshine vodka and marveling aloud why such as I were permitted to live when his boys had died so young. He often asked me that question. I did not know what to reply. When I failed to answer, he would hit me with a hard, flashing fist. I could not understand what he wanted from me. or why he beat me. I tried to keep out of his way. I did as I was told, but he continued the beatings. At night, Garbles would sneak into the kitchen where I slept and wake me by yelling into my ear. When I jumped up with a scream, he laughed while Judas struggled on the chain outside ready to fight. At other times when I was sleeping, Garbles would take the dog quietly into the room, tie its muzzle with rags, and then throw the animal on top of me in the darkness. The dog rolled over me while overcome by terror. While I, overcome by terror, not knowing where I was or what was happening, fought against a huge hairy beast that was scratching me with its paws. One day the vicar came in a dog cart to see Garbos. The priest blessed us both, and then he noticed the black and blue welts on my shoulders and neck and demanded who had beaten me and why. Garbos admitted that he had to beat me to punish me for laziness. The vicar then admonished him mildly and told him to bring me to church the next day. As soon as the priest had left, Garbos took me inside, stripped me, and flogged me with the willow switch, avoiding only the visible parts such as my face, arms, and legs. As usual, he forbade me to cry, but when he hit a more sensitive spot, I could not stand the pain and let out a whimper. Droplets of sweat appeared on his forehead and a vein started swelling on his neck. He jammed some thick canvas in my mouth and, passing his tongue over his dry lips, continued flogging me. Early the next morning, I started on my way to church. My shirts and pants were sticking to the bloody patches on my back and buttocks. But Garbos warned me that if I whispered a word about the beating, he would set Judas on me in the evening. I bit my lips, swearing that I would not say a word and hoping that the vicar or the vicar would not notice anything. I'm gonna lie. Wherever this author got these stories, I'm sure they really happened in real life. So it's pretty fucked up, you know? Despite what I said, this book is kind of, I don't know, because the idea that it's not a true story, I thought it was like more of a biography, but all novels have some truth to it, you know? I just wonder how much they added to it. Excuse me. In the brightening light of dawn, a crowd of venal women waited in front of the church. Their feet and bodies were swathed in strips of cloth and wraps of odd sorts, and they babbled endless words of prayer while their cold, benumbed fingers shifted the rosary beads. When they saw the priest coming, they rose unsteadily, teetering on their knotty canes, and rapidly shuffled to meet him, contesting for priority and kissing his greasy sleeve. I stood aside, trying to remain unnoticed, but those with the best sight stared at me with disgust, called me a vampire or gypsy foundling, and spat 3 times in my direction. The church always overwhelmed me, and yet it was one of the many houses of God scattered all over the world. God did not live in any of them, but it was assumed for some reason that he was present in all of them at once. It was like the unexpected guest for whom the wealthier farmers always kept an additional place at their table. The priest noticed me and patted my hair warmly. I grew confused as I answered his questions, assuring him that I was now obedient, that the farmer did not have to beat me anymore. The priest asked me about my parents, about our pre-war home, and about the church which we had attended but which I could not remember very well. Realizing my total ignorance of religion and church observances, he took me to the organist and asked him to explain the meaning of liturgical objects and to start preparing me for service as an altar boy at morning mass and vespers. I began coming to church twice a week. I waited at back until the old woman had crawled to their pews, and then I took a back seat closely to the holy water font, which mystified me tremendously. This water looked like any other water. It had no color, no odor. It looked far less impressive than, for example, ground horse bones. Yes, but yet its magic power was supposed to far exceed that of any herb, incantation, or mixture that I had ever seen. I understood neither the meaning of the mass nor the role of the priest at the altar. All of this to me was magic, more splendid and elegant than Olga's witchcraft, but just as difficult to fathom. I looked with wonder at the stone structure of the altar, the finery of the cloths hanging from it, the majestic tabernacle in which the divine spirit dwelled. With awe I touched the fancifully shaped objects stored in the sacristy, the chalice with the shining, polished interior where wine changed into blood, the gilded paten on which the priest dispensed the Holy Ghost, the square, flat burse in which the corporal was kept. This burst opened at one side and resembled a harmonica. How poor Ogle's hut was by comparison full of its evil-smelling frogs, rotting pus from human wounds and cockroaches. When the priest was away, the church and the organist was busy with the organ in the balcony. I would stealthily enter the mysterious sacristy to admire the humeral veil which the priest used to slip over his head and with a nimble movement slide down his arms and loop around his neck. I would stroke my fingers voluptuously along the alb placed over the humeral, smoothing out the fringes of the alb belt, smelling the ever-fragrant maniple which the priest wore suspended from his left arm, admiring the precisely measured length of the stole, the infinitely beautiful patterns of the chasubles, whose varied colors, as the priest explained to me, symbolized blood, fire, hope, penance, and mourning. While performing her magic incantations, Olga's face had always taken on changing expressions that aroused fright or respect. She rolled her eyes, shook her head rhythmically, and made elaborate movements with her arms and palms. In contrast, the priest, while saying the Mass, remained the same in everyday life. In contrast, the priest, while saying the Mass, remained the same as in everyday life. He merely wore a different robe and spoke a different language. His vibrant, sonorous voice seemed to buttress the dome of the church, even awakening the sluggish old women sitting in the tall pews. They would suddenly gather their drooping arms and with difficulty raise their wrinkled eyelids, resembling shriveled, heavy, late-cut pea pods. The bleak pupils of their dimmed eyes would glance fearfully around, uncertain of where they were, until finally beginning anew their ruminations of the words from an interrupted prayer, they rocked back to sleep like wilted heather swayed by the wind. The Mass was ending. The old woman thronged the aisles, jockeying to reach the priest's sleeves. The organ fell silent. At the door, the organist greeted the priest warmly and gave me a sign with his hand. I had to return to work, to sweep the rooms, feed the cattle, prepare the meal. Every time I came back from the pasture, the hen house, or the stable, Garbles would take me into the house and practice, at first casually and then more eagerly, new ways of flogging me with a willow cane or hurting me with his fists and fingers. Fuck Garbles, the bitch. My welts and cuts, having no chance to heal, turned into open sores, seeping yellow pus. At night I was so terrified of Judas that I could not sleep. Every night, every slight noise, every creaking of the floorboards would jolt me into attention. I stared into the impenetrable darkness, pressing my body into the corner of the room. My ears seemed to grow to the size of half pumpkins, straining to catch any movement in the house or yard. Even when I finally dozed off, my sleep was disturbed by dreams of dogs howling through the countryside. I saw them lifting their heads to the moon, sniffing in the night, and I sensed my approaching death. Hearing their calls, Judas would sneak up to my bed, and when he was quite close, he would jump on me at Garbles' command and maul me. The touch of his saliva would make rising blisters on my body, and the local man of cures would have to burn them out with a red-hot poker. I would wake up screaming, and Judas would start barking and jumping at the walls of the house. Garbles, half awake, would rush into the kitchen, thinking thieves had broken into the farm. When he realized that I had yelled for no reason, he beat and kicked me until I was out of breath. I remained on the mat, bloody and bruised, afraid to fall asleep again and risk another nightmare. In the daytime, I went around in a daze and was beaten for neglecting my work. Sometimes I would fall asleep on the hay in the barn while Garbles looked for me everywhere. When he found me idling, it started all over again. I came to the conclusion that Garbles' seemingly unmotivated fits of rage must have some mysterious cause. I recalled the magic incantations of Marta and Olga. They were meant to influence diseases and such things that had no obvious connection with the magic itself. I decided to observe all the circumstances accompanying Garbles' attack of fury. Once or twice I thought I had detected a clue. On 2 consecutive occasions I was beaten immediately after scratching my head. Who knows, perhaps there was some connection between the lice on my head, which was undoubtedly disturbed in their normal routine by my searching fingers, and Garbles' behavior. I immediately stopped scratching, even though the itching was unbearable. After 2 days of leaving the lice alone, I was beaten again. I had to speculate anew. My next guess was that the gate in the fence leading to the clover field had something to do with it. 3 times after I went through that gate, Garbles called me to him and slapped me when I approached him. I concluded that some hostile spirit was crossing my path at the gate and inciting Garbles against me. I decided to avoid the evil one at the gate by scrambling over the fence. This hardly improved matters. Garble cannot understand why I took time to climb over a high fence instead of taking the shortcut route through the gate. He thought I was mocking him on purpose, and I got an even worse beating. He suspected me of malice and tormented me ceaselessly. He amused himself by jabbing a hoe handle between my ribs. He threw me into the beds of nettles and thorny bushes like a misbehaving cat, and afterwards laughed at the way I scratched the stings on my skin. He threatened that if I continued to be disobedient, he would hold a mouse on my belly, as husbands did to unfaithful wives. This terrified me more than anything else. I visualized a mouse under a glass cup on top of my belly button. I could feel the indescribable agony as the trapped rodent gnawed its way through my navel and into my entrails. I pondered various ways of casting a spell on Garbles, but nothing seemed feasible. One day when he tied my foot to a stool and tickled it with an ear of Rye, I recalled one of the old Olga stories. She had told me of a moth with the death's head pattern on its body that was similar to the one I had seen on the uniform of the German officer. If one caught such a moth and breathed on it 3 times, the death of the oldest member of the household would shortly follow. That is why young married couples awaiting their inheritance from living grandparents spent many nights chasing after these moths. After that, I made a habit of wandering about the house at night when Garbles and Judas were asleep, opening windows to let the moths in. They came in swarms, starting an insane dance of death around the flickering flame, colliding with each other. Others flew into the flame and were burnt alive or stuck in the melting wax of the candle and were trapped. It was said that divine providence had changed them into various creatures, and in every new incarnation they had to endure the sufferings most appropriate to their species, but I was a little concerned with their penance. I was looking for just one moth, though I had to wave my candle in the window and invite them all in. The light of the candle in my movements startled Judas, and his barking woke up Garbles. He sneaked up behind me, seeing me, candle in hand, jumping all over the room with a swarm of flies, moths, and other insects. He was convinced that I was practicing some sinister gypsy rite. On the following day I received exemplary punishment. But I did not give up. After many weeks, just before dawn, I finally caught the desired moth with the strange markings. I breathed on it carefully 3 times and then let it go. I fluttered around the stove for a few moments and then vanished. I knew that Garbles had only a few days to live. I looked at him with pity. He had no idea that his executioner was on the way from a strange limbo inhabited by disease, pain, and death. Perhaps it was already in the house, waiting eagerly to cut the thread of his life as a sickle cuts a frail stick. I did not mind being beaten as I stared intently at his face, looking for the signs of death in his eyes, if he knew only what was awaiting him. However, Garbles continued to look quite strong and healthy. On the 5th day, when I began to suspect that death was neglecting its duties, I heard Garbles cry out in the barn. I rushed there, hoping to find him breathing his last and calling for a priest, but he was only bending over the dead body of a small turtle he had inherited from his grandfather. It had been quite tame and lived in its own corner of the barn. Garbles was proud of this turtle because it was the oldest creature in the whole village. Eventually, I exhausted all the possible means of bringing about his end. Garbles, in the meantime, invented new ways of persecuting me. Sometimes he hung me by the arms on a branch of the oak tree, leaving Judas loose underneath. Only the appearance of the priest in his dog cart caused him to discontinue that game. The world seemed to close over my head like a massive stone vault. I thought of telling the priest what was going on, but I was afraid he would just admonish Garbles and give him a chance to beat me again for complaining. For a while I planned to escape from the village, but there were many German outposts in the neighborhood, and I was afraid that if I was caught by them again, they would take me for a gypsy bastard, and then who knows what might happen to me. One day I heard the priest explaining to an old man that for some prayers God granted 100 or 300 days of indulgence. When the peasant failed to understand the meaning of these words, the priest went into a long exposition. From all this I understood that those who say more prayers earn more days of indulgence, and that this was also supposed to have an immediate influence on their lives. In fact, the greater the number of prayers offered, the better one would live, and the smaller the number, the more troubles and pain one would have to endure. Suddenly the ruling pattern of the world was revealed to me with beautiful clarity. I understood why some people were strong and others weak, some free and others enslaved, some rich and others poor, some well and others sick. The former had simply been the first to see the need for prayer and for collecting the maximum number of days of indulgence. Somewhere far above all these prayers coming from earth were properly classified, so that every person had his bin where his days of indulgence were stored. I saw in my mind the unending heavenly pastures full of bins, some big and bulging with days of indulgence, others small and almost empty. Elsewhere I could see unused bins to accommodate those who, like myself, had not yet discovered the value of prayer. I stopped blaming others. The fault was mine alone, I thought. I had been too stupid to find the governing principle of the world of people, animals, and events. But now there was order in the human world, and justice too. One had only to recite prayers, concentrating on the ones carrying the greatest number of days of indulgence. Then one of God's aides would immediately note the new member of the faithful and allocate to him a place in which his days of indulgence would start accumulating like sacks of wheat piled up at the harvest time. I was confident in my strength. I believed that in a short while I would collect more days of indulgence than other people, that my bin would fill quickly, and that heaven would have to assign me a larger one, and even that would overflow, and I would need a bigger one, as big as the church itself. Feigning casual interest, I asked the priest to show me the prayer book. I quickly noted the prayers and marked with the largest number of indulgence days, and asked him to teach them to me. He was somewhat surprised by my preference for some prayers and indifference to others, but he agreed and read them to me several times. I made an effort to concentrate all the powers of my mind and body in memorizing them. I soon knew them perfectly. I was ready to start a new life. I had all that was needed and gloried in the knowledge that the days of punishment and humiliation would soon be past. Until now I had been a small bug that anyone might squash. From now on, the humble bug would be an unapproachable bull. There was no time to lose. Any spare moment could be used for one more prayer, thus earning additional days of indulgence for my heavenly account. I would soon be rewarded with the Lord's grace, and garbles would not torment me anymore. I now devoted my entire time to prayers. I rattled them off quickly, one after another, occasionally slipping in one that carried fewer days of indulgence. I did not want heaven to think that I neglected the more humble prayers completely. After all, one cannot outwit the Lord. Garbles could not figure out what happened to me. Seeing me continuously mumbling something under my breath and paying little attention to his threats, he suspected that I was casting some gypsy spells on him. I did not want to tell him the truth. I was afraid that in some unknown manner he might forbid me to pray, or even worse, as a Christian of older standing than myself, use his influence in heaven to nullify my prayers or perhaps divert some of them to his own undoubtedly empty bin. He started to beat me more often. Sometimes when he asked me something and I was in the middle of a prayer, I would not answer him immediately, anxious not to lose the days of indulgence which I was just earning. Garbles thought I was getting impudent and wanted to break me down. He was also afraid that I might get bold enough to tell the priest about the beatings. Thus my life was spent alternately praying and being beaten. I muttered prayers continuously from dawn to dusk, losing count of the days of indulgence I was earning, but almost seeing their pile visibly rising until some of the saints, stopping on their strolls through the heavenly pastures, looked approvingly at the flocks of prayers soaring up from earth like sparrows, all coming from a small boy with black hair and black eyes. I visualized my name being mentioned at the councils of angels, then at those of some minor saints, later at those of major saints, and so closer and closer to heavenly throne. Garbles thought that I was losing respect for him, even when he was beating me harder than usual. I did not lose time, but continued collecting my days of indulgence. After all, pain came and went, but the indulgences were in my bin forever. The present was bad precisely because I had not known earlier about such a marvelous way of improving my future. I could not afford to lose any more time. I had to make up for lost years. Garbles was now convinced that I was in a gypsy trance which could bring no good. I swore to him that I was only praying, but he did not believe me. His fears were soon confirmed. One day a cow broke through the barn door and went into a neighbor's garden, causing considerable damage. The neighbor was furious and rushed into Garbles' orchard with an axe and cut down all the pear and apple trees in revenge. Garbles was sleeping dead drunk, and Judas was helplessly straining at his chain. To complete the disaster, a fox got into the hen house the next day and killed some of the best laying hens. That same evening, with one stroke of his paw, Judas massacred Garbles' pride, a fine turkey he had purchased recently at great expense. Of course he's going to blame it on the gypsy. It's fucked up, huh? I wonder if this little boy's a Jew. I'm assuming he's a Jew, right? So Garbles broke down completely. He got drunk on moonshine vodka and revealed to me his secret. He would have killed me long ago had he not been afraid of St. Anthony, his patron. He knew too that I had counted his teeth and that my death would cost him many years of his life. Of course, he added, if Judas should kill me accidentally, then he would be perfectly safe from my spells and St. Anthony would not punish him. In the meantime, the priest was sick at the vicarage. He apparently caught a cold in the chilly church. He was lying in a fevered and hallucinatory state in his room, talking to himself or to God. I once took the vicar some eggs, a gift from Garbles. I climbed on the fence to see the vicar. His face was pale. His older sister, a short, buxom woman with her hair piled in a bun, was fussing about the bed, and the local wise woman was letting his blood and applying leeches which grew plump as soon as they fastened on his body. I was astonished. The priest must have accumulated an extraordinary number of days of indulgence during his pious life, and yet here he was lying sick like anybody else. A new priest arrived at the vicarage. He was old, bald, and had a very thin, parchment-like face. He wore a violet band on his cassock. When he saw me returning with the basket, he called me and asked me where I, with my swarthy looks, had come from. The organist, seeing us together, quickly whispered some words to the priest. He gave me his blessing and walked away. The organist then told me that the vicar did not want me to make myself too conspicuous at church. Many people came there, and although the priest believed that I was neither a gypsy nor a Jew, the suspicious Germans might take a different view, and the parish would suffer severe reprisals. I quickly rushed to the church altar. I started reciting prayers desperately, and only those with the greatest number of days of indulgence attached to them. I had little time left. Besides, who knows, perhaps prayers at the altar itself, under the tearful eye of God's Son and the motherly gaze of the Virgin Mary, might carry greater weight than those said elsewhere. They might have a shorter route to travel to heaven, or they might possibly be carried by a special messenger using a faster conveyance like a train on rails. The organist saw me alone in the church and reminded me again about the new priest's warning. So I bade farewell gratefully to the altar and all its familiar objects. Garbles was waiting for me at home. As soon as I entered, he dragged me to an empty room in the corner of the house. There at the highest point of the ceiling, 2 large hooks had been driven into the beams. Less than 2 feet apart, leather straps were attached to each as handles. Garbles climbed on a stool, lifted me high, and told me to grab a handle with each hand. Then he left me suspended and brought Judas into the room. On his way out, he locked the door. Judas saw me hanging from the ceiling and immediately jumped up in an effort to reach my feet. I brought my legs up and he missed them by a few inches. He started another run and tried again, still missing. After a few more tries, he lay down and waited. So he's not even hanging him. He's told him to hold on by himself. I had to watch him. When freely hanging, my feet were no more than 6 feet above the ground, and Judas could easily reach them. I did not know how long I would have to hang like this. I guess that Garb was expecting me to fall down and be attacked by Judas. This would frustrate the efforts I had been making all these months, counting Garbles' teeth, including the yellow, ingrown ones at the back of his mouth. Innumerable times when Garbles was drunk with vodka and snoring open-mouthed, I'd counted his loathsome teeth painstakingly. This was my weapon against him. Whenever he beat me too long, I reminded him of the number of his teeth. If he did not believe me, he could check the count himself. I knew every one of them, no matter how wobbly, how putrefied, or how nearly hidden under the gums. If he killed me, he would have very few years left to live. However, if I fell down into the waiting fangs of Judas, Garbles would have a clear conscience. He would have nothing to fear, and his patron, St. Anthony, might even give him absolution for my accidental death. My shoulders were becoming numb. I shifted my weight open and closed my hands and slowly relaxed my legs, lowering them dangerously near to the floor. Judas was in the corner pretending to be asleep, but I knew his tricks as well as he knew mine. He knew that I still had some strength left and that I could lift my legs faster than he could leap after them, so he waited for fatigue to overcome me. The pain in my body raced in 2 directions. One went from the hands to the shoulders and neck, the other from the legs to the waist. There were 2 different kinds of pain, boring toward my middle like 2 moles tunneling each other together, or underground, tunneling toward each other underground. There were 2 different kinds of pain, boring toward my middle like 2 moles tunneling toward each other underground. The pain from my hands was easier to endure. I could cope with it by switching my weight from one hand to the other, relaxing the muscles and then taking the load up again. Hanging on one hand while blood returned to the other, the pain from between my legs and abdomen was more persistent, and once it settled in my belly, it refused to leave. It was like a woodworm that finds a cozy spot between a knot in the timber and stays there forever. It was a strange, dull, penetrating pain. It must have been like the pain felt by a man Garbles mentioned in Warning. Apparently this man had treacherously killed the son of an influential farmer, and the father had decided to punish the murderer in the old-fashioned manner. Together with his 2 cousins, the man brought the culprit to the forest. There they prepared a 12-foot stake sharpened at one end to a fine point like a gigantic pencil. They laid it on the ground, wedging the blunt end against the tree trunk. Then a strong horse was hitched to each of the victim's feet while his crotch was leveled with the waiting point. The horses gently nudged, pulled the man against the spiked beam, which gradually sank into the tense flesh. When the point was deep into the entrails of the victim, the man lifted the stake together with the impaled man upon it and planted it in a previously dug hole. They lifted him there to die slowly, or they left him there to die slowly. Now hanging under the ceiling, I could almost see the man and hear him howling into the night, trying to lift to the indifferent sky, his arms hanging over the bloated trunk of his body. He must have looked like a bird knocked out of a tree by a slingshot and fallen flabbily onto a dried out pointed stalk. Still feigning indifference, Judas woke up below. Oh, fucking, give me 1 second, guys. A fucking fly. I hate flies. So fucking the little boy is just hanging right there. So fucking sad. Still feigning indifference, Judas woke up below. He yawned, scratched behind his ears, and hunted the fleas in his tail. Sometimes he glanced slyly at me, but turned away in disgust when he saw my hunched legs. He only fooled me once. I thought he had really gone to sleep and straightened out my legs. Judas instantly bounced off the floor, leaping like a frog. One of my feet did not jerk up fast enough, and he tore off some skin at the heel. The fear and pain almost caused me to fall. Judas licked his chops triumphantly and reclined by the wall. He watched me through the slits of his eyes and waited. I thought I could not hold on any longer. I decided to jump down and plan my defense against Judas, though I knew that I wouldn't even have time to lift a hand before he would be at my throat. There was no time to close. Got him. There was no time to lose, and suddenly I remembered the prayers. I started shifting weight from one hand to the other, moving my head, jerking my legs up and down. Judas looked at me, discouraged by this display of strength. Finally, he returned Finally, he turned toward the wall and remained motionless. Time went by and my prayers multiplied. Thousands of days of indulgence streaked through the hatched roof toward heaven. Late in the afternoon, Garbles came into the room. He looked at my wet body and the pool of sweat on the floor. He took me off the hooks roughly and kicked the dog out. All that evening, I could neither walk nor move my arms. I lay down on the mattress and prayed. Days of indulgence came in hundreds and thousands. Surely by now there are more of them in heaven for me than grains of wheat in the field. Any day, any minute, notice of this would have to be taken in heaven. Perhaps even now the saints were considering some radical improvements of my life. Radical improvement of my life. Garbles hung me up every day. Sometimes he did it in the morning and sometimes in the evening. And had he not been afraid of foxes and thieves and needed Judas in the yard, he would have done it at night too. It was always the same. While I still had some strength, the dog stretched out on the floor calmly, pretending to sleep or casually catching flies. When the pain in my arms and legs became more intense, he grew alert as though sensing what was going on inside my body. Sweat poured from me, running in rivulets over my straining muscles, hitting the floor with regular plip-plops. As soon as I straightened my legs, Judas invariably leaped at them. Months went by. Garbles needed me more around the farm because he was often drunk and didn't want to work. He hung me up only when he felt he had no particular use for me. When he sobered up and heard the hungry pigs and the lowing cow, he took me off the hooks and put me to work. The muscles of my arms became conditioned by the hanging and I could endure it for hours without much effort. Although the pain that came to my belly began later now, I got cramps which frightened me, and Judas never missed a chance to leap at me, though by now he must have doubted he would ever catch me off guard. That's a fucked up motherfucker, you know? It's a fucked up dude. While I hung on the straps, I concentrated on my prayers to the exclusion of all else. When my strength ebbed, I told myself that I should be able to last another 10 or 20 prayers before I dropped down. After these were recited, I made another promise to myself of 10 or 15 prayers. I believed that something could happen at any moment, that every extra 1,000 days of indulgence could save my life, perhaps at this very instant. Sometimes to divert my attention from the pain and from my numb arm muscles, I teased Judas. First I swung on my arms as though I were about to fall down. The dog barked, jumped, and raged. When he went to sleep again, I would wake him with cries and the smacking of his lips and grinding of teeth. He could not understand what was happening. Thinking that this was the end of my endurance, he leaped about madly, knocking into the walls in the darkness, overturning the stool standing by the door. He grunted with pain, heaved heavily, and finally rested. I took the opportunity to straighten my legs. When the room resounded to the snoring of the fatigued beast, I saved strength by setting prizes for myself for endurance, straightening one leg for every 1,000 days of indulgence, resting one arm for every 10 prayers, and one major shift of position for every 15 prayers. At some unexpected moment, I would hear the clatter of the latch and Garbles would enter. When he saw me alive, he would curse Judas, kick and beat him until the dog cried and whimpered like a puppy. His fury was so tremendous that I wondered if God himself had not sent him at this moment. But when I looked at his face, I could find no trace of the divine presence. I was now beaten less often. The hanging took up a lot of time and the farm required attention. I wonder why he went on hanging me up. Did he really expect the dog to kill me after it had failed to do so all these times? After each hanging, I took a while to recover. Muscles stretched like yarn on the spinning wheel refused to retract to the normal span. I moved with difficulty. I felt like a stiff, frail stalk trying to support the burden of a sunflower blossom. When I was slow at my work, Garbles used to kick me and say that he would not support an idler, and threatened to send me to the German outpost. I tried to work harder than ever to convince him of my usefulness, but he was never satisfied. Whenever he got drunk, he put me on the hooks with Judas waiting patiently below. The spring of 1943 passed. I was already 10 years old, and I had accumulated who knows how many days of indulgence for each day of my life. A great church feast was approaching, and people in the villages were busy preparing festive clothes. The women made wreaths of wild thyme, sundew, linden, apple flowers, and wild carnations, which would be blessed in the church. The nave and the altars of the church were decorated with green branches of birch, poplar, and willow. After the feast, these branches would acquire great value. They would be planted in vegetable beds and cabbage and hemp and flax fields to ensure rapid growth and protection against parasites. On the day of the feast, Garbles went to the church early in the morning. I remained at the farm, bruised and aching from my last beating. The broken echo of tolling church bells rolled over the fields, and even Judas stopped lounging in the sun and listened. It was Corpus Christi. It was said that on this day the bodily presence of the Son of God would make itself felt in the church more than on any other feast. Everybody went to church that day, the sinners and the righteous, those who prayed constantly and those who never prayed, the rich and the poor, the sick and the well. But I was left alone with the dog that had no chance of achieving a better life, even though it was one of God's creatures. I made a quick decision. The store of prayers which I had accumulated could surely rival those of many younger saints, and even though they had not produced perceptible results, they must have been noticed in heaven, where justice is the law. I had nothing to fear. I started on my way to church, walking along the untilled strips which separated the fields from each other. The churchyard was already overflowing with an unusually colorful throng of people and their gaily decorated carts and horses. I sat in a hidden corner waiting for an opportune moment to slip into the church by one of the side doors. Suddenly the vicar's housekeeper spotted me. One of the altar boys selected for the day had fallen sick with poisoning, she said. I had to go immediately into the vestry, change, and take his place at the altar. The new priest had ordered it himself. A hot wave swept over me. I looked at the sky at last. At last, someone up there had noticed me. They saw my prayers lying in a huge heap like potatoes piled high at the harvest time. In a moment I would be close to him, at his altar, within the protection of his vicar. This was only a beginning. From now on, a different, easier life would begin for me. I had seen the end of terror that shakes one until it squeezes the stomach empty of vomit like a punctured poppy pod blown open by the wind. No more beatings from garbles, no more hangings, no more Judas. A new life was opening before me, a life as smooth as the yellow fields of wheat waving under the gentle breath of the breeze. I ran to the church. It was not easy to get inside. The garish crowd overflowed around the churchyard densely. Someone noticed me immediately and drew attention to me. The peasants rushed at me and began to scourge me with osier branches and horsewhips, the older peasants laughing so hard that they had to lie down. I had to get that fly. Oh, God. I was dragged under a cart and then tied to the tail of a horse. I was held fast between the shafts. The horse neighed and reared and kicked me once or twice before I succeeded in freeing myself. I reached the vestry trembling and my body ached. The priest, impatient at my delay, was ready to proceed. The ministrants had also finished dressing. I shook with nervousness as I put on the altar boy's sleeveless mantle. Whenever the priest looked away, the other boys tripped me up or poked me in the back. The priest, puzzled by my slowness, became so furious that he shoved me roughly. I fell on a bench, bruising my arm. Finally, everything was ready. The doors of the vestry opened, and in the stillness of the crowded, expectant church, we took our places at the foot of the altar, 3 of us on each side of the priest. The mass proceeded in all its splendor. Fuck that priest too, man. He got kicked by a horse. The priest's voice was more melodious than usual. The organ thundered with its 1,000 turbulent hearts. The altar boys carried out solemnly their meticulously inculcated functions. I was suddenly jabbed in the ribs by the altar boy standing next to me. He gestured nervously toward the altar with his head. I stared uncomprehendingly as blood pounded in my temples. He gestured again, and I noticed that the priest himself was throwing me expectant glances. I was supposed to do something, but what? I panicked. I lost my breath. The acolyte turned toward me and whispered that I must carry the missal. Then I realized that it was my duty to transfer the missal from one side of the altar to the other. I had seen this done many times before. An altar boy would approach the altar, grasp the missal together with the base on which it stood, walk backward to the center of the lowest step in front of the altar, kneeling, holding the missal in his hands, then rise and carry the missal to the other side of the altar and finally return to his place. Now it was my turn to perform all this. I felt the gaze of the entire crowd on me. At the same time, the organist, as if to attach deliberate importance to this scene of a gypsy assisting at the altar of God, suddenly hushed the organ. Absolute silence held the church. I mastered the trembling of my legs and climbed the steps to the altar. The missal, the holy book filled with sacred prayers collected for the greater glory of God by the saints and learned men throughout the centuries, stood on a heavy wooden tray with legs tipped by brass balls. Even before I laid my hands on it, I knew that I would not have strength enough to lift it and carry it to the other side of the altar. The book itself was too heavy even without the tray, but it was too late to withdraw. I stood on the altar platform, the lean flames of the candles flickering in my eyes. Their uncertain flutter made the agony-racked body of the crucified Jesus seem almost lifelike. But when I examined his face, it did not seem to be gazing. The eyes of Jesus were fixed somewhere downward, below the altar, below us all. I heard an impatient hiss behind me. I placed my sweaty palms under the cool tray of the missal, breathed deeply, and straining to the utmost raised it. My breath bated. I cautiously stepped back, feeling the edge of the step with my tiptoe. Suddenly, in an instant of time as brief as the prick of a needle, the weight of the missal grew overwhelmingly and tipped me backward. I staggered and could not regain my balance. The ceiling of the church reeled. The missal and its tray tumbled down the steps. An involuntary shout sprang from my throat. Almost simultaneously, my head and shoulders struck against the floor. When I opened my eyes, angry, red faces were bent over me. Rough hands tore me up from the floor and lifted me toward the doorway. The crowd parted in stupefaction. From the balcony, a male voice shouted, "Gypsy, vampire," and several voices took up the chant. Hands clamped my body with excruciating hardness, tearing out my muscles. Outside, I wanted to cry and beg for mercy, but no sound came from my throat. I tried once more. There was no voice in me. The fresh air hit my heated body. The peasants dragged me straight toward a large manure pit. It had been dug 2 or 3 years ago, and the small outhouse standing next to it with small windows cut in the shape of the cross was subject of special pride to the priest. It was the only one in the area. The peasants were accustomed to attending to the wants of nature directly in the field and only used it when coming to church. A new pit was being dug on the other side of the presbytery, however, because the old pit was completely full and the wind often carried foul odors to the church. When I realized what was going to happen to me, I again tried to shout, but no voice came from me. Every time I struggled, a heavy peasant hand would drop on me, gagging my mouth and nose. The stench from the pit increased. We were very close to it now. Once more I tried to struggle free, but the men held me fast, never ceasing their talk about the event in the church. They had no doubt that I was a vampire, and the interruption of the high mass could only bode evil for the village. We halted at the edge of the pit, its brown, wrinkled surface steamed with fetor, like horrible skin on the surface of a cup of hot buckwheat soup. Over this surface swarmed a myriad of small white caterpillars about as long as a fingernail. Above the surface circled clouds of flies, buzzing monotonously with beautiful blue and violet bodies glittering in the sun, colliding, falling toward the pit for a moment, and soaring into the air again. I retched. The peasants swung me by the hands and feet. The pale clouds on the blue sky swam in my eyes. I was hurled into the very center of the brown filth which parted under my body to engulf me. Daylight disappeared above me, and I began to suffocate. I tossed instinctively in the dense element, lashing out with my arms and legs. I touched the bottom and rebounded from it as fast as I could. A spongy upswell raised me toward the surface. I opened my mouth and caught a dash of air. I was sucked back below the surface and again pushed myself up from the bottom. The pit was only 12 feet square. Once more I sprang up from the bottom, this time toward the edge. At the last moment, when the down swell was about to pull me under, I caught hold of a creeper of the long, thick weeds growing over the edge of the pit. I fought against the suction of the reluctant maw and pulled myself to the edge of the pit, barely able to see through my slime-obscured eyes. I crawled out of the mire and was immediately gripped with cramps of vomiting. They shook me so long that my strength vanished, and I slid down completely exhausted into the stinging, burning bushes of thistle, fern, and ivy. I heard the distant sound of the organ and humans singing, and I reasoned that after the mass, the people might come out of the church and drown me again in the pit if they saw me alive in the bushes. I had to escape, and so I darted into the forest. The sun baked the brown crust on me, and clouds of large flies and insects besieged me. As soon as I found myself in the shade of the trees, I started rolling over in the cool, moist moss, rubbing myself with cold leaves and vomiting. With pieces of bark, I scraped off the remaining muck. I rubbed sand in my hair and then rolled in the grass and vomited again. Suddenly I realized that something had happened to my voice. I tried to cry out, but my tongue flapped helplessly in my open mouth. I had no voice. I was terrified and covered with cold sweat. I refused to believe that this was possible and tried to convince myself that my voice would come back. I waited a few moments and tried again. Nothing happened. The silence of the forest was broken only by the buzzing of the flies around me. I sat down. The last cry that I had uttered under the falling missile still echoed in my ears. Was it the last cry I would ever utter? Was my voice escaping with it like a solitary duck call strained over a huge pond? Where was it now? I could envision my voice flying alone under the high-arched, vaulting ribs of the church roof. I saw it knocking against the cold walls, the holy pictures against the thick panes of colored glass in the windows, which the sun's rays could scarcely penetrate. I followed its aimless wanderings through the dark aisles where it wafted from the altar to the pulpit, from the pulpit to the balcony, from the balcony to the altar again, driven by the multi-chorded sound of the organ and the ground swell of the singing crowd. All the mutes I had ever seen paraded by under my lids. There were not very many of them, and their absence of speech made them seem very much alike. The absurd twitching of their faces tried to substitute for the missing sound of their voices, while the frantic movement of their limbs took the place of their unforthcoming words. Other people always looked at them with suspicion. They appeared like strange creatures, shaking, grimacing, dribbling heavily down their chins. There must have been some cause for the loss of my speech, some greater force with which I had not yet managed to communicate, commanded by destiny. I began to doubt that it could be God or one of his saints. With my credit secured by vast numbers of prayers, my days of indulgence must have been innumerable. God had no reason to inflict such terrible punishment on me. I'd probably incurred the wrath of some other forces which spread their tentacles over those God had abandoned for some reason or other. I walked farther and farther from the church, plunging into the thickening forest. From the black earth that the sun never reached stuck out the trunks of trees cut down long ago. These stumps were now cripples, unable to clothe their stunted, mutilated bodies. They stood single and alone. Hunched and squat, they lacked the force to reach up toward light and air. No power could change their condition. Their sap would never rise up into limbs or foliage. Large knotholes low on their bowls were like dead eyes staring eternally, with unseen pupils at the waving crests of their living brethren. They would never be torn or tossed by the winds, but would rot slowly. The broken victims of the dampness and decay of the forest floor. I walked farther and farther from the church, plunging into the thickening forest, from the black earth that the sun never reached, stuck out of the trunks of trees cut down long ago. These stumps were now cripples, unable to clothe their stunted, mutilated bodies. They stood single and alone. Hunched and squat, they lacked the force to reach up toward the light and air. No power could change their condition. Their sap would never rise up into limbs or foliage. Large knotholes low on their bowls were like dead eyes staring eternally, and unseen pupils at the waving crests of their living brethren. They would never be torn or tossed by the winds, but would rot slowly, the broken victims of the dampness and decay of the forest floor. It's a fucked up chapter, man. Church people,